In the final weeks of World War II, as Japan's empire teetered on the edge of annihilation, an enemy they had long dismissed as slow to mobilize erupted across Manchuria with overwhelming speed and force. Entire armored columns vanished under Soviet fire. Elite divisions collapsed in hours. And inside Tokyo's military headquarters, stunned officers whispered one phrase again and again: "This cannot be happening." Because for years, Japan's generals believed Manchuria was their unbreakable fortress. In August 1945, they discovered the truth far too late. For more than a decade, the Kwantung Army stood as one of Imperial Japan's proudest military achievements, a force that had once operated with near-total autonomy along the fringes of Manchuria. In the early 1930s, it was this formation, acting on its own initiative, that engineered the Mukden incident and seized vast territories that would become the puppet state of Manchukuo. Its senior officers cultivated a reputation for audacity. Its units, hardened by years of frontier conflicts, had been viewed as an elite vanguard of Japanese power on the Asian mainland. But by 1945, the Kwantung Army was a hollow echo of the force that had once intimidated Asia. Veterans who had spent years mastering the harsh terrain of Manchuria were long gone, transferred to the Pacific, where Japan's shrinking empire demanded every able-bodied soldier. What remained in the Northeast were hastily raised conscripts, ill-trained security troops, and under-equipped garrison formations. Many divisions existed more on paper than in reality. Some lacked modern artillery, others drilled with wooden rifles. Even tanks were scarce, outdated, or immobilized from lack of fuel. Commanders who had once enjoyed freedom of strategic initiative were now forced to make do with dwindling supplies, poor communications, and the constant expectation that they would delay, not defeat, any serious threat. And yet in Tokyo, a dangerously optimistic belief persisted. Many within the Imperial General Staff argued that even if the Soviet Union emerged victorious in Europe, it would be months before Stalin could redeploy significant forces across the continent. The Trans-Siberian Railway, they claimed, was overburdened. Soviet industry had suffered immense strain. Soldiers who had taken Berlin would need rest and refitting before fighting again. The Kwantung Army, even in its weakened state, was expected to have enough time to prepare defensive lines along Manchuria's rugged frontier. These assumptions fed into a larger diplomatic delusion. As the war in the Pacific turned against Japan, Tokyo clung to the hope that Moscow, officially still neutral under the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact of 1941, might mediate a negotiated peace with the United States and Britain. Diplomats pressed for meetings. Messages pleaded for Soviet goodwill. Every whisper of possible mediation was treated as a lifeline. But behind the closed doors of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin had already made his decision. At the Yalta Conference earlier that year, he had secretly agreed to enter the war against Japan. Soviet planners had spent months preparing Operation August Storm, a massive, multi-axis offensive involving more than 1.5 million troops, thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns, and combined arms tactics refined in the drive from Stalingrad to Berlin. While Tokyo hoped for time, the Red Army was finalizing a timetable for a lightning campaign. And along the quiet borderlands of Manchuria, Japanese intelligence stations began to notice subtle shifts: rail traffic increasing at night, armored brigades assembling in the steppe, and supply depots expanding with unusual speed. Reports were dispatched to higher command, only to be dismissed as exaggerated, premature, or politically inconvenient. By the time anyone in Tokyo chose to listen, the Red Army had already begun to move. Midnight descended over Manchuria on August 8, 1945, beneath a sky without warning. To the Japanese soldiers scattered across its plains, deserts, and mountain passes, the night seemed ordinary, quiet, windless, unchanged. But in the darkness beyond their observation posts, the largest offensive Japan had ever faced was already unfolding. Along a front stretching nearly 4,000 kilometers, Soviet artillery began to roar in perfectly timed waves, sending shock ripples across the frontier. The first shells struck with the force of an earthquake. Within minutes, entire sectors lit up in blinding flashes as the Red Army opened Operation August Storm. From the east, west, and north, three massive Soviet fronts surged forward: the Transbaikal Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky, the First Far Eastern Front under Marshal Kirill Meretskov, and the Second Far Eastern Front commanded by General Maxim Perkiev. Their armored spearheads advanced in ways Tokyo had never believed possible. Columns of T-34s and his two heavy tanks crashed through the Greater Khingan Range, a mountain barrier the Kwantung Army considered nearly impenetrable. In the south, mechanized brigades raced across the Gobi-like deserts of Inner Mongolia, places Japanese planners assumed would halt any large-scale mechanized movement. But Soviet scouts had charted routes in secret. Engineers had prepared fuel depots and water caches months in advance. The impossible for the Red Army had become a matter of logistics. Within hours, the Kwantung Army's communication network began to unravel. Outposts positioned along the eastern frontier, some manned by little more than border guards and conscripted labor battalions, were overwhelmed before sunrise. Radio stations called for air support they knew would not come. Others sent their final transmissions while Soviet armored columns closed in behind them. Entire units disappeared without leaving a single survivor to report what had happened. The speed of the Soviet advance shattered the Japanese assumption that this would be a long, grinding conflict. Instead, the front was simply gone. In the chaos, frantic messages poured into headquarters. Panic signals from forward commanders repeated the same desperate assessment: enemy tanks everywhere. Officers who had expected to hold their defensive positions for weeks realized they had lost them before dawn. A few managed to transmit coordinates of breaches, but Tokyo received fragmentary, conflicting information, too much to comprehend, too late to stop. In the capital, shock rippled through the Supreme War Council. Beginning in the early hours of August 9, senior ministers read incoming reports faster than they could be processed. Diaries from staff officers later recalled the stunned silence in the room. One general wrote that the Soviet columns moved, like a steel tide, sweeping aside everything in their path. Another noted that the rapid collapse of their northern defenses defied all prior estimates. But as devastating as the first reports were, they represented only the opening phase of a far greater disaster. And yet, the worst news had not even reached them. The speed of the Soviet advance was staggering, almost unreal to those who watched it unfold from Manchuria's shattered defenses. Tank brigades, some numbering hundreds of T-34s and Su-76 self-propelled guns, surged forward at 40, 50, sometimes 70 miles a day, cutting through the open plains and river valleys as though the mountains and deserts Japan had believed impassable were mere illusions. Manchurian strongholds, fortified over a decade and expected to resist for weeks, collapsed within hours. Fortified bunkers were abandoned, supply depots destroyed or captured before soldiers could even fire a shot. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, realized with bitter clarity that its weapons were obsolete. Anti-tank rifles that had been adequate in the 1930s ricocheted harmlessly off the Soviet T-sloped armor. Mortar fire and field guns, hurriedly deployed, failed to halt the onrushing steel tide. For years, Japanese planners had relied on intelligence and doctrines rooted in the interwar Soviet army, unaware that their adversaries had learned, adapted, and transformed into a mechanized force honed in the blood of Eastern Europe. Civilians were swept into the maelstrom. Refugees crowded the railways, families clinging to suitcases and carts, abandoning homes as the Soviet spearheads rolled past. Japanese logistics, already crippled by years of war in the Pacific, could not cope. Trains stalled under the weight of fleeing populations. Armored convoys became targets, leaving broken vehicles and scattered supplies littering the roads. Communications frayed under the pressure, orders arriving late or not at all, leaving commanders to improvise in a vacuum of information. In Tokyo, the High Command was confronted with casualty estimates that defied belief. Divisions, once counted in tens of thousands, were listed as missing, overrun, or annihilated. Reports from surviving officers conveyed a sense of disbelief, as if the reports were hallucinations rather than reality. Senior generals wrote in diaries that the Red Army's speed and coordination could not have been imagined, comparing it to a force that seemed to materialize from nowhere, consuming everything in its path. For the Japanese government, the truth crystallized with terrible clarity. The Soviets were not advancing to negotiate or to seek concessions. Operation August Storm was a hammer descending on Japan's last continental army, a blow that would shatter the illusion of control Tokyo had clung to since the start of the Pacific War. Command posts went silent. Strongpoints became tombs. The once feared Kwantung Army, hollowed and overstretched, was crumbling like paper under the relentless pressure of Soviet mechanized warfare. And then came the message that broke whatever illusion of control Tokyo still held, a dispatch so concise, so devastating, that it transformed panic into absolute dread. The Soviet offensive was not just succeeding, it was unstoppable. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm too vast to control. Senior generals gathered around polished oak tables, their uniforms immaculate, but their faces betraying disbelief. Reports from Manchuria arrived with a relentless, grim cadence, entire divisions encircled, anti-tank weapons useless, communication networks shattered. Some officers refused to believe the dispatches, insisting the numbers were exaggerated, the chaos a temporary setback. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Japan, was disintegrating before their eyes. Post-war interrogations reveal the depth of their shock. One senior staff officer admitted, "I had never imagined the Soviets could execute such a rapid, coordinated offensive." Another confessed, with quiet resignation, the Kwantung Army no longer exists as a fighting force. The horror of those words was amplified by what they represented, not just the loss of troops or territory, but the unraveling of Japan's imperial ambitions, the collapse of its eastern frontier, and the loss of Manchuria, the economic heart of the empire, faster than Okinawa or Saipan had fallen under American assault. The generals argued fiercely, some clinging to the hope that Tokyo could still rally. Maps sprawled across tables showed towns and rail junctions slipping into Soviet hands almost hourly. One veteran commander reminded his colleagues that Japan had fought to hold islands with far fewer resources. Yet here, in Manchuria, the story was utterly different. Reports of refugees clogging the railway lines, of civilian panic, and of abandoned stockpiles brought a grim realization. Logistical collapse was complete. Advisors to Emperor Hirohito warned that if the Soviets pressed further, there would be no safe ground left. Hokkaido could face invasion next, and Japan could be carved up like Germany had been, a nation partitioned before the world. Morale fractured. Some generals argued that continuing the fight was a matter of honor, that the spirit of the army could still turn back the tide. Others, voices trembling but resolute, said surrender was the only course to prevent the annihilation of what remained, both military and civilian, of the Japanese nation. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of these decisions, as the reality outside their walls moved faster than any council or plan could contain. Humiliation, fear, and desperation intertwined, forming a knot that no strategy could untangle. Every new report from the front lines was a dagger through Japan's hope, and every calculation, once optimistic, now revealed only a relentless advance, a nation slipping beyond saving. By August 12, Tokyo faced a truth it could no longer ignore. The war was already lost. By the first week of August 1945, the Soviet pincers were closing with relentless precision. Harbin, Mukden, Changchun, cities that had once been bastions of Japanese control, were encircled, their defenses crumbling under the weight of mechanized brigades and massed artillery. The Kwantung Army, stripped of its elite units and reduced to skeleton formations, issued its last coordinated orders. Not to counterattack, not to hold ground, but to retreat where possible, surrender if surrounded. Even in these final commands, the desperation was palpable, a tacit acknowledgement that the war on the mainland had already been lost. Breakout attempts, heroic in their ambition but doomed from the start, were swiftly annihilated. Japanese officers in isolated posts described Soviet armored columns appearing, as if from thin air, surging through mountain passes and river valleys that had been assumed impassable. Entire battalions vanished in hours, leaving nothing but abandoned rifles, overturned vehicles, and broken radios that crackled with static instead of orders. The speed, coordination, and ferocity of the Red Army left Tokyo reeling. Inside the capital, panic spread beyond the military. Cabinet ministers debated the unimaginable: Soviet landings on Hokkaido, Kyushu, even Honshu itself. Intelligence reports confirmed that Soviet forces were advancing through Korea and Sakhalin, threatening the very home islands. For decades, Japanese planners had feared only the Americans. Now, the looming shadow of Stalin's army made clear that Japan's destiny could be dictated from the north, not across the Pacific. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had already shattered morale, breaking the will of a nation that had endured 6 years of total war. But the Soviet offensive dealt a blow of a different kind, a strategic and psychological rupture. It was one thing to face the unimaginable power of the Manhattan Project. It was another to witness a land army, 1.5 million strong, moving with the speed and coordination of a single organism, sweeping aside every hope of organized resistance. Within the Emperor's Council, the debate over surrender terms became urgent and bitter. The stakes were now crystal clear. Delay could mean a post-war Japan carved and occupied not by American planners, but by Soviet generals, with consequences for the nation's political and cultural survival that were almost unthinkable. Every hour of indecision risked not just the annihilation of remaining troops, but the permanent loss of Japan's sovereignty. Tokyo's grim realization crystallized in the corridors of power. The question was no longer whether to surrender, but who Japan would be surrendering to. On August 15, 1945, Japan formally announced its surrender. Across the Pacific, the shockwaves of the atomic bombings had already fractured morale, but in Manchuria, the Red Army continued its relentless advance, sweeping through cities and countryside that had once been the pride of the Kwantung Army. Entire divisions had vanished, supply lines were obliterated, and the command structure that had once projected authority across thousands of miles now existed only in fragments. The surrender came not at the moment of Japanese military defeat in isolation, but at the intersection of two cataclysmic forces: nuclear devastation and the unstoppable mechanized assault of Operation August Storm. Post-war reflections from Japanese generals underline the scale of the surprise. Many repeatedly described the Soviet offensive as beyond anything we were prepared for, a blitzkrieg perfected over years of fighting in Europe, delivered against a foe that had overestimated its own control and underestimated the enemy's capabilities. The speed, coordination, and sheer volume of men and machines shattered decades of strategic assumptions. The Kwantung Army, once hailed as the sword of the empire, had collapsed so swiftly that Tokyo's final decision to surrender was as much a reaction to its destruction as to the atomic bombings. The geopolitical consequences rippled far beyond Manchuria. The Soviet occupation of northern Korea laid the foundations for the peninsula's eventual division, planting the seeds of the Korean War. In China, Communist forces gained access to Japanese stockpiles of weapons and materiel, dramatically shifting the balance in the civil war against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. What had been a war fought largely for territory and honor now reshaped the political landscape of East Asia for decades to come. Japan's strategic blindness becomes painfully clear in hindsight. Tokyo had believed the Soviet Union to be slow-moving, diplomatically pliable, and unlikely to strike until long after the defeat of Germany. That assumption, grounded in wishful thinking and outdated intelligence, left the empire exposed to a calculated, overwhelming assault. The collapse of the Kwantung Army was not merely a military failure, but the consequence of a nation's inability to reconcile myth with reality. The human dimension of this collapse is visible everywhere. Abandoned outposts with rusting artillery, silent railways once bustling with troops and supplies, and the ruins of fortifications meant to withstand months of siege, now empty. The echoes of a once feared army linger in the wind, a reminder that empires are fragile not only in their structures but in their perceptions of themselves. This was not just the end of a campaign, it was the collapse of an illusion.